The smell arrives before the light does. It is sulfur and char and something deeper, something the human body recognizes before the mind assigns it a name. The smell of metal being unmade and remade. The smell of the Earth's own marrow, extracted and forced into a new shape at temperatures that have no equivalent in the natural world. It is 1901. The furnace at the south end of the mill stands 32 meters tall. Its throat glows the color of a setting sun viewed through smoke and ash. And from that throat, every 45 minutes, 400 tons of molten iron pour into a runner channel carved from compressed sand. The pour lasts 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, the heat radiating from the surface of the metal is sufficient to blister skin at a distance of 6 meters. The men who work the cast floor do not stand at 6 meters. They stand at 2. They wear leather. They wear cloth wrapped over the lower face. They wear nothing that fully protects them, because nothing exists that fully protects them, and the furnace cannot wait for better technology. The furnace waits for nothing. By 1910, this complex, sprawling across 2,000 acres of reclaimed lakeshore, will be the largest steel-producing operation in human history. It will pour more metal in a single year than the entire continent of Europe combined managed in a decade before the Civil War. It will supply the beams for skyscrapers that will not be demolished for another 100 years. It will feed the railroads, the warships, the bridges. And it will kill quietly, not in explosions, not in collapses the newspapers will cover for a week and forget. It will kill in increments, in lungs that darken over a decade, in blood that carries metals it was never designed to carry, in the slow arithmetic of bodies surrendered to a process that was always larger than the men feeding it. The men knew. The men went in anyway. That is not a story of ignorance. That is a story about power, about who decides what a human life is worth when the alternative is not building the country at all. There is a question that runs beneath this entire story like a seam of iron or beneath bedrock, and it must be asked plainly before anything else can be understood. How does a civilization justify consuming its own builders? Not in metaphor, not in abstraction. In the literal, biological sense, how does a nation look at the men feeding its furnaces, breathing its emissions, absorbing its byproducts through the skin and the mouth and the airways, and decide that this arrangement is acceptable, that the cost is distributed correctly, that the transaction is, in some defensible sense, fair? The answer the early 20th century gave was not spoken aloud. It was architectural. It was written into shift schedules and wage structures and the careful geographic placement of company housing directly downwind of the stacks. The steel was necessary. The men were available. And availability, in an industrial economy with no regulatory floor, functions as consent. That is the paradox this film will not resolve. It will only show you its dimensions. To understand what the furnace was built to feed, you must first understand the scale of what America was becoming in the final decades of the 19th century. Between 1870 and 1900, the United States added 45,000 miles of railroad track. Not repaired, not upgraded, added. Cities that did not exist in 1850 had populations of 500,000 by 1890. Chicago alone consumed more structural steel per decade than the entire British Empire had used in the previous century to build its railways across 3 continents. The country was not growing. It was erupting, and eruption requires material. Steel, specifically, because wood rots, brick cracks under lateral load, and cast iron shatters under tension. Only steel, rolled into beams and pressed in a plate, could carry the weight of what was being built. The Brooklyn Bridge required 14,000 tons of it. The home insurance building in Chicago, the world's first true skyscraper, demanded structural steel on a scale that existing mills could not supply without expanding operations beyond anything previously attempted. The nation had written a check against a future it had not yet built the infrastructure to honor. The mills were the infrastructure. The complex that would become the answer to that demand was not built in a single act of vision. It was assembled in stages, each expansion more aggressive than the last, each addition pushing the operational boundary of what steel production had previously been understood to permit. It began with Andrew Carnegie's decision in the 1870s to adopt the Bessemer converter on an industrial scale at his Edgar Thomson Works outside Pittsburgh. A process that could convert a single charge of pig iron into finished steel in less than 20 minutes, compared to the 2 weeks required by the older puddling furnace method. The speed was staggering. The implications were immediate, but Bessemer had limits. It could not process high phosphorus ore, which comprised the majority of what lay beneath the Great Lakes Basin. That constraint drove the shift to the open hearth furnace. A slower process, burning 6 to 8 hours per heat, but capable of accepting inferior ore and producing steel of controlled, consistent composition. Carnegie's successors understood what this meant. When United States Steel Corporation was incorporated in 1901, capitalized at $1.4 billion, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history, it did not merely inherit existing mills. It inherited a doctrine that scale, pressed far enough, becomes a force of its own. That a furnace large enough does not merely produce steel. It produces the conditions under which an entire national economy becomes possible. They built accordingly. The open hearth furnace was, at its core, a controlled contradiction, a structure designed to sustain temperatures that its own materials could barely withstand. The furnace shell was fabricated from rolled steel plate, between 25 and 40 millimeters thick, bolted and riveted into a rectangular chamber roughly 30 meters long and 9 meters wide. Inside that shell, the working surface, the hearth itself, was lined with magnesite brick, a refractory material capable of enduring sustained contact with molten metal at temperatures exceeding 1,600 degrees Celsius. The brick lining was the furnace's most critical and most perishable component. Under continuous operation, a hearth lining lasted between 200 and 400 heats before it required full replacement. A single replacement took 4 days. The furnace did not stop for 4 days without consequence measured in tonnage and dollars. Heat was delivered through regenerative chambers, paired brick checkerwork stacks positioned at each end of the furnace. Gas and air entered through one set of chambers, preheated to over 1,000 degrees before ignition, then exhausted through the opposite set. Every 20 minutes, the flow reversed. The system was elegant and relentless. At full production, a single large open hearth furnace consumed 340 cubic meters of gas per minute. The combustion byproducts, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, manganese oxide particulate, vented through a stack. Some of it vented through the building. Some of it vented through the men. The toxicology was not unknown. It was inconvenient. By 1900, industrial medicine had already established with reasonable precision what prolonged manganese exposure did to the human nervous system. It attacked the basal ganglia, the deep structures governing motor control and emotional regulation, producing a progressive syndrome that physicians of the era called manganism, and that presented in its early stages as fatigue, mood disturbance, and subtle tremor. In its later stages, it produced rigidity, masked facial expression, and a gait disturbance so distinctive that neurologists could diagnose it from across a room. The steel mills generated manganese oxide dust in quantities that no ventilation system of the period could meaningfully dilute. Spiegelisen and ferromanganese, added to the open hearth heat as deoxidizing agents, volatilized during charging and tapping, releasing fine particulate at concentrations that the men on the cast floor and the charging aisles breathed continuously across 12-hour shifts. Silica was the quieter killer. Grinding, refractory repair, and slag handling fractured silica crystals into respirable particles that embedded permanently in lung tissue, initiating a fibrotic process that medicine in 1905 could describe but not reverse. Silicosis progressed over years. It left its evidence in lungs that, at autopsy, had the texture and density of wet concrete. Neither condition appeared in company health records as occupational in origin. The shift began at 6 in the morning and ended at 6 in the evening, and the man walking through the mill gate at dawn carried with him everything the company did not provide: food wrapped in cloth, water in a tin pail that would be warm within the first hour, and whatever private architecture of endurance he had constructed over years of doing this same thing in this same building. The heat inside the open hearth bay was not the heat of a warm room or an August afternoon. It was radiant and directional, emanating from the furnace doors in ways that a man learned to read the way a sailor reads weather, by the color, by the pressure against the face, by the particular quality of shimmer rising off the floor plates. Experienced workers could gauge furnace temperature by eye, reading the transition from cherry red through orange to the yellow-white that meant the heat was ready to tap, a skill acquired over years and stored entirely in the body rather than the mind. They worked in pairs on the tap floor. One man broke the clay plug sealing the tap hole with a steel bar. The other stood to the side with the runner clear and the ladle positioned. The molten metal entered the ladle in a stream that weighed, by the end of the pour, up to 200 tons. For this, in 1910, a man received between 16 and 19 cents per hour. He received no medical insurance. He received no pension. He received his wage, and if the work destroyed him, he received nothing further. The reckoning did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as accumulation. By 1910, the settlement houses operating in the mill districts of Pittsburgh and Gary had begun documenting what company physicians had been categorizing as individual misfortune. Crystal Eastman's landmark study, Work Accidents in the Law, published that year as part of the Pittsburgh Survey, examined 526 industrial deaths across Allegheny County in a single 12-month period. Of those deaths, 298 occurred in the steel industry. The majority left behind families with no compensation, no legal recourse, and no acknowledgement from the corporation that employed the dead man that his death bore any relationship to the conditions under which he had worked. The response from United States Steel was measured and strategic. The corporation introduced a safety committee. It published accident statistics. It did not alter the 12-hour shift, which its own internal studies identified as the primary contributor to the fatigue that preceded most fatal incidents. In 1919, after a decade of mounting pressure from labor organizers, investigative journalists, and progressive legislators, 365,000 steel workers walked off the job. They demanded the 8-hour day. They demanded union recognition. They demanded that their bodies be treated as finite resources rather than replaceable inputs. The strike was broken in 4 months. The 12-hour shift remained standard until 1923. What the strike failed to extract from the corporation, legislation eventually forced, but slowly, and against sustained resistance from an industry that had built its operating model on the assumption that labor costs included the destruction of the laborer. The first meaningful workers' compensation laws arrived state by state between 1911 and 1920, establishing the principle that workplace injury carried financial liability. But compensation schedules were constructed around acute injury, the crushed hand, the scalded arm, the fracture. Occupational disease, which progressed invisibly over years and left no single incident to assign liability to, remained largely outside the framework. Silicosis was not formally recognized as a compensable occupational disease in most American jurisdictions until the mid-1930s, decades after the pathology was clinically understood and industrially documented. Manganism followed a similarly delayed trajectory. The men who had already been consumed by those decades of non-recognition received nothing retroactively. The steel, however, remained. The buildings it framed still stood. The bridges it spanned still carried traffic. The warships it plated had already sailed and fought, and in some cases been sunk, their structural purpose fulfilled long before any accounting of the human cost beneath their hulls was ever seriously attempted. The skyline of the modern American city is, in measurable physical fact, a monument erected on the diminished bodies of men whose names do not appear on any beam or rivet or foundation plate. That is not an accusation. It is an inventory. The century that steel built was real. Its hospitals, its universities, its bridges carrying 10,000 vehicles across water that would otherwise be impassable. The standard of living those structures enabled was real. None of it is diminished by the acknowledgement that its foundation included a cost that was externalized onto the people least positioned to refuse it. What a civilization chooses to count, and what it chooses not to count, is not a technical question. It is a moral one. The furnace did not make that choice. The men who designed the compensation schedules made it. The legislators who delayed for decades made it. The steel endures. The debt does not expire simply because no invoice was ever issued.